Hi everyone, this is Daria Piano. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is about various ways of how one can practice a difficult passage. If you're tired of mindless, simple repetitions over and over again, and you really want to have a strategy of how to approach a difficult passage in order to make your practice most effective, then this video is great for you. I will share my 10 ways of practicing. And these 10 come from my own experience, from what I've learned from my teachers throughout my pianistic journey. And of course, it's a lot. I will try to be as concise as I can. And I will also try at the same time to give you as many examples as I can to illustrate each point. So I will use a second camera for that.
Before we get started, I realized when I started editing this video that it will be at least an hour long, and I'm sure you guys don't want to watch this in one long chunk of an hour. And I've decided it will be easier for everyone if I break it down into separate chapters. And this first chapter will be just a summary, a quick explanation of each of the 10 ways that I will be presenting. And later in separate videos, I will provide you with ample examples on each one of them, so you can get a really good idea of how they work.
First, I would like to define what a passage in music is, for me at least, what I consider for the purposes of this video, somewhat prolonged series of notes, like a string of notes, maybe 7 plus, because 7 is a scale and scale is considered a passage. And it has to have a particular structure or a pattern, and it has to be perceived as one musical gesture or a unit. Also, I would like to mention that there are different types of passages. There are passages including single notes, passages of double stops, passages of octaves, those I consider a separate category. There are passages of arpeggios and passages of chords. Also, it could be simultaneously in both hands, in unison, and there could be one-handed passages. So with all that being said, what I will be talking about here can be applied to any type of passage I've just mentioned. And those strategies are just easily modified based on what kind of passage you have, and I will have different examples to demonstrate. Another important thing to mention before we dive in is what kind of work one can do with a passage or any type of music. You can have technical work and musical work. These are different things, and yet I personally believe that musical work should always be present, and I personally never practice without, sometimes I have to shut my musicality down in order to really be in full control of my body movement and everything precisely. But it's a rare occasion. Usually I can't help but engage my musicality, but for the purposes of the video, we will only include technical work because musical work includes much more than technique. And I will be talking about technique here. And lastly, even when it comes to technique specifically, there could be different approaches to practicing technical things. And there are two types of practice. I will give you a sports analogy because I also like to do sports. I'll do calisthenics. So there's also such a notion of practicing for skill versus practicing for endurance. And in piano terms, for what goes for skills could be said clarity, accuracy, and comfort of your movements and gestures. And into the endurance basket, you could put speed and power. And for this video, I will only be talking about practicing for various skills. All of this out of the way, a lot of explanation, but I just have to clarify all these details in order for you to understand my approach. So these 10 ways will give you a good framework of understanding the action and the metamorphoses that happen to the passage in each particular variation. And this way, if you really understand the ground, you will be able to build your own exercises based on your particular piece with the notes that you have. Another general recommendation before we go on is I do recommend when it comes to practicing passage work to eliminate the use of pedal or bring it to the minimum, just to make sure that you are doing everything with your fingers and not substituting something with the foot. And also be very mindful of your fatigue level. You are the only ones who can control and who can assess how much fatigue for you is bearable and how much is too much. Play your hands, your wrists, your forearms, your fingers, and especially be alert to any kind of sharp pain. If you experience any sharp pain, you have to stop immediately and either bring your attention to the different hand or switch the type of exercise that you're doing with that hand. So make sure to do your fatigue assessment. The first strategy has to do with going from simpler to more complex. Simplifying, making the passage easier to handle, and then adding more and more layers as you become more and more comfortable with it, and going to the original that is written in the score. There are multiple ways of doing it. I'll give you some examples. You can shorten a passage. You can use octave displacement. You can eliminate notes. You can have breaks in between the segments in order for your hand to change the position comfortably. You can use transposition, that's a little more advanced. With the double stop passages, you can simply practice single note element out of the two notes, where instead of two notes connecting to two notes, you will have only one line connecting at a time and then the other line. And lastly, you can change to easier dynamics. For example, something in an extreme dynamic range is much harder than something at the mezzo forte or mezzo piano level. And this one hopefully is understood without demonstration. A second way is exactly opposite of the first. You want to increase the difficulty of the passage. It's like weighted training. I put a weight vest on you, and then when you remove it, every exercise seems so much easier. There are various ways to do that as well. One is repetition of a particular segment in the passage. Another is misplacement. So certain elements come at different places. I'll show you an example of that. Holding over, where one finger holds over instead of letting go to make it more difficult for the other fingers to do their work, engages more finger work than otherwise it would. Changing articulations to something more difficult, for example, going from legato to staccato or non-legato, because those require more active finger as well, or simply changing from one type of articulation, maybe every 4 notes, to the other. It also requires more attention towards your movements, your actions, and this is what you need. You want to be alert and sharp with every movement when you practice a passage. And lastly, you can make the passage longer instead of making it shorter, like in the previous example. Number 3 is the one I use very often, almost in every single piece I practice passages. Unifying or breaking up elements. These are two sides of the same coin. So if you have a passage full of double stops, you can break them and arpeggiate them and practice one voice connected to the other, or the other way around. There's many ways to do it. Or if you have some arpeggiated passages, then you can unify them, combine them into double stops, triple stops, quadruple stops, and different combinations of those. So the idea behind this strategy is to be able to understand the movement of that particular position all the way in and out. Every single connection in that passage has to be thought through, has to be felt through your fingers, and has to be understood in terms of motion. Number 4, it's called regrouping. This is the one I use in literally every piece I play. So instead of practicing in groups that are already designated in the score, let's say it's in 4 16th note groups, you regroup them in such a way where the connection goes over one note, let's say, right, instead. So what it does is it makes you 2 things. One, you rethink the shape of your passage in a different way, and motivic structure becomes more pronounced, clear, and that motivic connection becomes seamless, and the intonation has the clarity, and the line becomes very shapely. And the second thing is that it simply puts emphasis on different places, where you stop at a different place or break at a different place, which creates more attention towards the areas of the passage where you have a clumsy connection, let's say over or under the thumb. So these connections become much smoother and the passage becomes more unanimous. Number 5 is simply sequencing an element in the passage. So you take one motif out, let's say 3 or 4 notes, however many that seems to be the most difficult and gives you most trouble, and you make that into a sequence going through different keys, and it becomes its own exercise. Number 6, this one has a very mindful and very conscientious approach to a specific area in the passage, where you simply bring more attention to that particular turn or area by multiple ways. For example, one of them could be you sing along in that particular moment. You play that particular spot non-legato versus everything else being legato or staccato. You add a second hand on that particular turn. So basically you isolate the problem and you apply different strategies in order to focus on the problem more and making sure it's like using a highlighter, making sure you really are doing your best in that particular spot. Number 7 is a very simple one, and this one you might be familiar with. It's just changing rhythms. So you make some notes longer and some notes shorter, which creates a more unified stroke in the end for each of the notes. And it is a very efficient way to practice like really finger movement. But for me, I find it the most disinteresting, and I rarely use that method, but I will mention it because it's taught all the time and it's good to have it in your arsenal of tools. Number 8, I put in a separate category, but what it is just combinations of various approaches I mentioned earlier and combining them in one exercise for the passage. Number 9 has to do with slow practice. Simple, slow, and very slow practice. These two I find to be different. Simple, slow could be slow tempo where it's still perceived as a continuous line and you can still musically play it. Very slow is slightly different for me. I'll show you the difference in what I mean. So the slow practice is very effective in finding comfort in your movement and really grounding your sound. Just make sure when you do practice slowly, you're not doing it without your conscious being present and you controlling your movement. This is very important that you do it in proper form, in proper way, so you are in control of your movement all the time. And another important thing about slow practice, and also I forgot to mention that in my first point of making the passage easier, do not change fingering of the passage. This is not a way to simplify it, because the fingering that can be done in a slow tempo will be impossible in a fast tempo perhaps. So you need to stick to the fingering that you will eventually play. And another important point about slow and very slow practice is that you need to make sure that your movements that are required for the fast tempo are retained when you play slowly. Those movements include the wrist movement, the elbow movement, and everything that you need to control in order to execute the passage eventually in a fast tempo. So you first, of course, need to understand what kind of movements you need, and then you apply those movements in the slow tempo as well. Number 10 is plain repetition. However, there's one catch. When you repeat a passage, you need to have a very clear goal of why you are doing it. One very good goal is you are in a stage where you just found a great, comfortable way to play this passage and you want to retain it. You need to replicate the exact same thing you just did. So your repetition is focusing on repeating that same thing again. All these movements, you do it again. If it didn't work out, you do it, you try it again, right? Very mindful repetition, not just simple repetition on autopilot. That's a very different kind of repetition. This repetition won't get you far. And another thing about repeating is you can be repeating something with a specific purpose. You're going to repeat again and you're going to focus on that little 4 and 5 movement. That's the goal of your repetition, that you are going to do your best so that sounds clear. Yes, repetition plays its role, but it has to be mindful repetition with a goal in mind. All right, that's it for this video. I hope it was useful, and I hope you understood the framework behind these strategies and these different ways of approaching passage practice. And if you did, great, then it means that you can construct your own practice routines with any passage from your repertoire. Please leave your comments below and let me know if you use any of these strategies, or something was new and interesting, or you found something to be not effective and you have some other ideas how to practice a passage. And I would like to also offer you an opportunity to consult with me to ask my opinion about a particular passage in a particular piece you're working on. So if you leave me the name of the composer, the name of the piece, and the number of measures that you're struggling with, and if I get at least 10 requests, I'll make a separate video and I will show you how I would approach that particular passage.
This is it for chapter 1. As always, thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. And I hope the information was helpful. Feel free to leave your feedback below if you would like to share it with me. And stay tuned for next chapter. Thank you. Bye.